The smell of burnt hair and kerosene is something you never really wash out of your skin. I was kneeling in the dirt of my mother's garden shed, my palms blistering, watching my father drop the last of our family's history into a heater. He didn't even look angry. He just looked bored. In exactly 55 minutes, the police are going to breach that gate. And because of the restraining order my stepmother just signed, I'll be hauled away in zip ties while they toast my mental breakdown with vintage Cristal. But here's the thing. My father thinks he's winning because he finally moved the sapphire ring to a city vault. He thinks he's liquidated my inheritance to save his failing firm. He has no idea that I just saw the serial number. He has no idea who he's actually selling that stone to, or that the woman sleeping in his bed is currently planning his murder. Let me take you back to how this brunch started. The scent of oversteeped Earl Grey and scorched hollandaise hung heavy in the dining room of the Greenwich estate. Sarah Miller gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles whitening against the dark wood. Across the floral centerpiece, Tyler leaned into his velvet chair, rotating his hand to catch the morning light. The sapphire pulsed with a deep, oceanic blue, trapped in a silver setting never intended for his thick, nicotine-stained finger. "Tyler," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, the sound vibrating in the hollow of her chest. "Return it. Now." He didn't flinch. Instead, he plucked a piece of cold bacon from his plate and chewed with deliberate, rhythmic motions. The ring clinked against his crystal flute as he took a sip of mimosa. The sound was like a hammer against a bell, echoing through the vaulted ceiling of the dining room. "This old trinket?" Tyler spread his fingers, admiring the heirloom as if it were a prize from a plastic vending machine. "It adds a certain flair to the ensemble, don't you think?" The silverware rattled. Sarah's gaze locked onto the stone, the same one her mother wore while kneading bread, the same one that caught the light in the hospice ward. It looked grotesque on him, a stolen fragment of a life he'd spent years dismantling. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was the last physical anchor Sarah had to a woman the rest of the family had tried to erase. "It isn't a costume, Tyler. Take it off before I lose my patience." He chuckled, a dry sound that grated like sandpaper against Sarah's nerves. He tilted his head, eyes gleaming with a practiced, casual cruelty. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Sarah. It's just silver and glass. Besides, possession is 9/10 of the law, or whatever garbage your father used to spout." He reached for the teapot, the sapphire mocking her with every movement. Sarah's chair screeched against the hardwood as she stood. The air in the room curdled, smelling of old money and fresh bile. Tyler didn't stop pouring. He simply smiled at the steam rising between them, a ghost of a man playing with a ghost of a treasure. Sarah's hand dipped into her pocket. Her thumb found the smooth, cold surface of her silver digital counter. Click. The sound was sharp, a metallic snap that only she truly understood. It was the count of the first lie of the morning. Tyler's implication that the ring was his to wear. "That ring was promised to me in my mother's will," Sarah stated, her voice a flat line of clinical precision. "Fact, you have no legal claim to it. Observation, you are wearing it specifically to incite a reaction." Robert Miller, seated at the head of the table, didn't look up from his plate. He adjusted his white silk shirt, one of the 47 identical ones he kept in a ledger-controlled rotation, and checked his Patek Philippe. The gold of the watch caught the light, a blinding glint that seemed to signal the end of Sarah's allotted time for grievances. "Robert," Sarah said, turning her focus to the architect of the room's suffocating atmosphere. "I need the codes to the study safe. Today." Aunt Deborah mentioned the locks were changed, and I can only assume my mother's correspondence was moved inside. Robert finally looked up. His silver hair was slicked back so tightly it looked like a helmet of polished chrome. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he tapped his heavy signet ring against the mahogany. 1, 2, 3 times. A territorial marking. "The house is undergoing a restructuring, Sarah," Robert said, his voice a smooth, velvet gravel. "Safety measures. Surely a woman of your analytical mind understands the need for security in uncertain times. Eat your eggs. They're getting cold." Sarah felt the lie vibrating in the air. Click. Her thumb pressed the counter in her pocket. 2 lies. The locks weren't about security. They were about exclusion. She looked toward the corner of the room where Aunt Deborah sat, her hands shaking so violently she had to set her teacup down. Deborah's eyes darted toward the floor, then the ceiling, avoiding the predatory gaze of her brother. "Sorry," Deborah whispered, though she hadn't bumped into anything. She was apologizing to the very air for the tension she was forced to witness. She leaned in toward Sarah, her voice a frantic, low-frequency hum. "He's moved everything, Sarah. The gallery deeds, the appraisals. He's locking the world out. You're not just a daughter anymore. You're a liability on a balance sheet." The confirmation hit Sarah like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The betrayal wasn't a slow burn. It was a sudden, total eclipse. Her inheritance, the gallery her mother had bled for, was being swallowed by the man who had already consumed her mother's spirit. Tyler stood up, his large frame casting a shadow over Sarah's plate. He cracked his knuckles, one by one, a sound like dry branches snapping in a winter wind. "I think the lady of the house has had enough facts for one morning, don't you? Maybe it's time for you to go back to your little apartment in the city." He moved toward her, his presence an intentional invasion of her personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale sweat. As he reached out to grab her elbow, Sarah felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over her. This wasn't a family brunch, it was a siege. "Don't touch me, Tyler," she warned, her voice steady. "Or what?" Tyler asked, his voice rising in that irritating, interrogative lift. "You're going to count me to death?" He lunged. It was a clumsy, heavy-handed movement, the kind of grab a man makes when he's never been told no by someone he considers beneath him. Sarah didn't hesitate. She stepped inside his reach, her center of gravity low and immovable. She grabbed his extended wrist and his shoulder, using the momentum of his own weight against him. In a blur of motion that defied the stagnant air of the dining room, she executed a perfect Brazilian jiu-jitsu toss. Tyler didn't just fall, he sailed. The crash was magnificent. He slammed into the heavy crystal sideboard, his back shattering the glass doors. A dozen heirloom decanters exploded, spraying amber bourbon and jagged shards across the floor. The sound was a cacophony of destruction that seemed to shatter the very facade of the Miller estate. Tyler groaned, slumped amidst the wreckage, a smear of red beginning to bloom on his white sleeve. Robert stood, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the bruises on Tyler's ego. But Sarah wasn't looking at Robert. She was looking at the floor. In the chaos, Tyler's phone had skittered across the hardwood, landing near her feet. She scooped it up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, subverted. Sarah retreated toward the foyer, her thumb flying across the screen of Tyler's phone. She knew Tyler used his birthday as a passcode. He was nothing if not predictable. The screen flickered to life. This was the moment she needed. If she could find one shred of evidence, one text, one email proving they were conspiring to sell her mother's gallery, She could go to the police. She could stop the liquidation. She opened the messaging app. Her eyes scanned the threads. There, a conversation with a contact labeled Pawn King. The blue stone is authentic, 4.2 carats. I have the papers. Meet at the shop at 4 p.m. to finalize the transfer. My daughter won't be an issue. Sarah felt a surge of triumphant heat. This was it. The smoking gun. The Pawn King was Richard Brooks, a man her mother had always warned her about. The text was dated this morning. She had them. She could feel the weight of the victory, the sheer logical perfection of her move. She had the phone, she had the proof, and she had the physical leverage of Tyler being incapacitated. For the first time in years, Sarah felt she was holding the steering wheel of her own life. She looked at the screen, a small smile touching her lips. She would take this to the authorities, and the Miller empire would crumble under the weight of its own greed. She began to back toward the front door, her mind already mapping the route to the precinct. She could hear Robert's heavy footsteps approaching from the dining room, but she didn't care. She had the truth. Then she scrolled up. Her thumb froze. The contact wasn't just Pawn King. The previous messages in the thread weren't from Tyler. They were responses to a message sent from this very phone, but the tone was different. Make sure the girl sees the ring at brunch. I want her volatile. I want a reason to call the police. I've already drafted the restraining order. Sarah's breath hitched. A cold prickle of dread crawled up her spine. She looked at the sent messages. They weren't written in Tyler's sloppy, question-filled slang. They were written with the clinical grandiosity of Robert Miller. The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. Robert hadn't been a passive bystander. He had used Tyler's phone to send those messages. He had anticipated her stealing it. He had wanted her to steal it. She looked up just as Robert entered the foyer. He wasn't angry. He was smiling. A thin, predatory stretch of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, Jennifer Miller, her stepmother, emerged from the shadows of the hallway, holding a stack of legal papers. Jennifer began that low, haunting funeral hum, the sound vibrating through the floorboards like a death knell. "Thank you, Sarah," Robert said, his voice a smooth, terrifying purr. "I was wondering how I'd get you to commit a felony on camera. Theft of personal property combined with the assault on Tyler. It makes the judge's job so much easier." Sarah looked at the phone in her hand. It wasn't evidence of his crime. It was the evidence of hers. He had planted the Pawn King thread, knowing she'd find it, knowing she'd take the bait. She hadn't outsmarted him. She had walked directly into the cage he'd built for her. The phone felt like it was burning her palm. She had lost the high ground, the evidence, and her freedom all in one calculated stroke. "Jennifer," Robert said, checking his watch. "Show our guest the door. The clock is ticking." Jennifer stepped forward, the smell of peppermint gum cloying and sharp. She handed Sarah a blue folder. "This is a formal restraining order, Sarah dear. You have exactly 60 minutes to gather your things and vacate the premises. If you are still on the property at 1 p.m., the officers stationed at the gate will arrest you for trespassing in violation of a court order." Sarah gripped the folder, the paper crinkling under her touch. The foyer felt smaller, the ceiling dropping an inch with every breath. The death hum from Jennifer's throat grew louder, a rhythmic droning that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. 60 minutes, Sarah whispered, her mind racing. Observation. You had this prepared before I even arrived. Fact. This brunch was a legal execution. Perception is the only truth that matters, Sarah, Robert said, turning his back on her to adjust a painting on the wall. "And right now, the perception is that you are an unstable, violent young woman who just attacked her brother and stole his property. I suggest you move quickly. I'd hate for your last memory of this house to be in handcuffs." Sarah turned and bolted up the stairs. The rhythmic click-click-click of her counter in her pocket was the only sound in her ears. She had to find the real ring. If it was being sold at 4 p.m., it had to be here. Or at least, the paperwork had to be here. She reached her father's study, the air inside smelling of old leather and expensive cigars. She began tearing through the room. She ignored the desk. Too obvious. She went for the portrait of her mother that usually hung above the fireplace. It was gone. She found it seconds later, lying face down in the corner behind a leather armchair, the frame cracked. The sight of it sent a jolt of grief through her, but she pushed it down. She noticed a small black dome in the corner of the ceiling, a security camera. It wasn't pointed at the door or the safe. It was tilted down, tracking her movements in the center of the room. She was being watched, a rat in a maze, and Robert was likely enjoying the show from his tablet downstairs. She moved to the bookshelf, pulling back a false front of leather-bound volumes. Behind it sat a small digital keypad. She tried her mother's birthday. Access denied. She tried her own. Access denied. The red light on the keypad blinked like a taunting eye. She looked at her watch. 45 minutes left. She ran toward the garage. If the ring was being moved to a vault or a pawn shop, the security consultant Robert employed would be the one to do it. The garage was a vast, sterile space, the concrete floor polished to a mirror shine. The fluorescent lights flickered in a rhythmic, 3-beat pulse that made Sarah's vision swim. "Looking for something, Miss Miller?" The voice was like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. Michael Davis stepped out from behind a charcoal gray SUV. He was a massive man, his shaved head reflecting the strobing lights. He stood with his arms crossed, exactly 5 feet away from her. In his hand, he held a small digital thermometer, which he dipped into a steaming paper cup. "I need the phone back," Michael said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Protocol dictates that all stolen property be returned before the transition period ends." "The transition period is a fancy word for a robbery, Michael," Sarah said, backing away toward her own car. "Fact, you are an accessory to fraud. Observation, you're nervous. You've checked that coffee 3 times in 30 seconds. Michael didn't blink. He tucked the thermometer into his pocket. "I don't get nervous. I follow the contract. Give me the phone, or I'll have to assist you in leaving the property prematurely." He lunged. Unlike Tyler, Michael was fast. He moved with a clinical efficiency, his large hand closing around Sarah's wrist with the force of a vice. The pain was immediate, a sharp, white-hot flare that made her knees buckle. "The phone?" he growled. Sarah's free hand fumbled in her pocket. Her fingers didn't find the phone, they found her car keys. She didn't think. She swung the heavy brass key ring in a wide arc, the jagged metal of her house key catching Michael across the forearm. He roared, the sound echoing off the concrete walls, and his grip loosened just enough. Sarah twisted away, her boots skidding on the polished floor. She dove into the driver's seat of her SUV, slamming the lock button just as Michael's fist hit the glass. The sound of the impact was like a gunshot. A spiderweb of cracks erupted across the driver's side window, but the reinforced glass held. Sarah jammed the car into reverse, the tires shrieking as she backed out of the bay. She saw Michael reaching into his jacket, but she didn't wait to see what he was pulling out. She swung the wheel, the SUV roaring as she floored the accelerator toward the estate gates. She tore through the manicured lawns, ignoring the gravel paths, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. She glanced at the passenger seat where Tyler's phone lay. She had escaped, but at what cost? She was a fugitive now, her car damaged, her hands shaking so hard she could barely steer. 2 miles down the road, she pulled over into a darkened cul-de-sac. The air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass from the neighboring lawns, a cloying, artificial scent that made her stomach turn. She picked up the phone and opened the camera roll. She had taken a burst of photos of the ring while Tyler was unconscious on the floor. She zoomed in on the sapphire. Her breath stopped. The stone in the photo was perfect. Too perfect. Under the high-resolution zoom, she could see the tiny, microscopic bubbles beneath the surface. The telltale sign of high-quality lead glass. "It's a fake," she whispered, the words disappearing into the sterile silence of the car. The realization was a second gut punch. The ring Tyler had been flaunting, the stone she had fought for, was a decoy. A cheap glass replica designed to bait her into a confrontation. The real sapphire, the 4.2-carat cornflower blue stone that carried her mother's legacy, wasn't in the house. It had been moved long ago. The brunch hadn't just been a legal trap. It was a shell game. Robert had used the fake ring to trigger her unstable behavior, providing the perfect cover while he moved the real assets behind the scenes. She had been fighting for a piece of glass, while her mother's life was being sold off in the shadows. She sat in the idling car, the heater blowing dry, dusty air into her face. She looked at her burned hand, the skin red and angry where the friction of Michael's grip had torn it. She felt a sudden, cold clarity. She had been playing by Robert's rules, reacting to his provocations, counting his lies as if the number mattered. But the truth didn't have a number. It had a weight. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. 1:15 p.m. She was officially in violation of the restraining order. The police would be looking for her charcoal SUV. She couldn't go to her apartment. She couldn't go to the gallery. She looked back toward the direction of the estate. The winter storm was beginning to roll in, the sky turning a bruised, heavy purple. The first flakes of snow began to drift against the cracked windshield. "Fact, I have no legal standing," she muttered to herself, her thumb clicking the counter in her pocket. Click. Observation. I have nothing left to lose. She knew where the real evidence was. It wasn't in the study. It wasn't in the vault. Her mother had always been a woman of the earth, a woman who trusted the soil more than the silk-lined walls of her husband's world. Sarah turned the car around. She didn't head for the main gates. She headed for the back of the property, where a narrow service road cut through the dense woods of the Greenwich estate. The snow was falling harder now, a white shroud that blurred the edges of the world. She killed the headlights as she approached the perimeter fence, the SUV bumping over the frozen ruts of the service road. She found a thicket of hemlocks and shoved the car as deep into the brush as it would go. She stepped out into the biting cold. The wind chill was plummeting, the air smelling of ozone and wet pine. She grabbed a heavy crowbar from the trunk, a tool she'd kept since her days restoring old frames, and began the long hike toward the garden shed at the edge of the property. The shed was a small, weather-beaten structure, half hidden by overgrown rhododendrons. It was the only place Robert never visited. He hated the smell of dirt and the spiders that lurked in the corners. Sarah reached the door, her lungs burning from the cold air. Inside, the temperature was a stagnant, heavy warmth, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and rusted iron. She didn't turn on the light. She used the pale glow of the snow outside to guide her. She moved the heavy bags of mulch, her muscles screaming with the effort. Beneath them lay the rotted floorboards her mother had always complained about. Sarah wedged the crowbar into a seam and heaved. The wood groaned and splintered, the sound echoing like a bone breaking in the small space. Beneath the boards sat a small, steel floor safe. It was rusted, the dial stiff from years of neglect. Sarah knelt, her fingers numbing. She didn't use a birthday this time. She used the serial number of the first painting her mother had ever sold, a number she had memorized when she was 6 years old. The dial clicked. The heavy door swung open. Inside wasn't the sapphire. Instead, there was a thick, leather-bound ledger and a stack of yellowed appraisal papers. Sarah pulled the book out, her hands trembling. She flipped it open. It wasn't a diary. It was a forensic map. Her mother had been documenting Robert's restructuring for years. Page after page of illicit transfers, shell companies, and diverted gallery funds. It was a record of a slow-motion robbery that had begun long before her mother's illness. I wondered if you'd find your way here. The voice came from the doorway. Sarah froze, the ledger clutched to her chest. Robert Miller stood in the entrance, his silhouette framed by the swirling snow. He wasn't wearing his silk shirt now. He was wrapped in a heavy wool coat, his face a mask of cold fury. In his hand, he carried a small, portable kerosene heater. "You always were the most troublesome part of the estate, Sarah," Robert said, stepping into the shed. He kicked the doors shut behind him, plunging them into a dim, orange-tinted gloom as he clicked the heater to life. A lingering debt that refused to be settled. Fact: you've been stealing from the gallery since 2010, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the cramped space. Observation: this ledger is enough to put you away for 20 years, Robert chuckled, the sound vibrating in the small room. He set the heater down on the potting bench. The smell of kerosene began to fill the air, thick and cloying. A book of fairy tales written by a dying woman? Who do you think the board will believe? The visionary who built this city? Or the daughter who just broke a restraining order to commit a burglary? He moved toward her, his hand outstretched. "Give me the book, Sarah. Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be." "No," Sarah said, backing into the corner. "This is the only thing left of her that you haven't burned." "Burned," Robert repeated, his eyes flickering toward the heater. An interesting choice of words. He lunged. He was stronger than he looked, his hands like iron as he grabbed for the ledger. Sarah fought back, her boots slipping on the dirt floor. They crashed into the potting bench, sending a child's tea set, the one Sarah had played with as a girl, shattering to the floor. Robert grabbed the kerosene heater and swung it. The metal casing hit the side of the bench, and the fuel ignited. A wall of orange flame erupted between them. Robert didn't flinch. He grabbed the ledger from Sarah's hands and thrust it toward the growing fire. "No!" Sarah screamed. She didn't think about the heat. She didn't think about the danger. She reached into the heart of the flames, her fingers closing around the charred leather of the book. The pain was immediate and absolute. A white-hot scream that began in her fingertips and radiated through her entire body. She tore the book away, falling back onto the dirt floor as she smothered the flames with her jacket. The smell of singed hair and scorched paper filled the shed. Robert stood over her, the fire reflecting in his eyes. He looked down at her burned hands, his expression one of mild disappointment. "You've ruined your hands for a pile of ash, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The genuine sapphire is already gone. I signed it over to Richard Brooks an hour ago to cover the final margin call on the firm. Your mother's legacy isn't a stone or a book. It's a zero on a balance sheet." He turned and walked out of the shed, leaving her in the smoke and the growing cold. Subverted. Sarah lay on the floor, the charred ledger clutched to her chest. Her hands were a map of agony, the skin blistering and raw. But she had the book. She had the proof. She forced herself to stand, her vision blurring from the pain. She had to get to the police. She had to show them the transfers. She stumbled to the window of the shed, looking out toward the main house. The blue and red lights of police cruisers were already winding up the driveway. Robert must have called them the moment he found her. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have the ledger. I have the truth." She opened the book, her burned fingers fumbling with the blackened pages. She just needed one clear entry, one signature she could prove was forged. She turned to the middle of the book. Her heart stopped. The pages weren't just charred, they were empty. She flipped through the entire ledger. Aside from the first few pages she had seen in the dim light, the rest of the book was a series of blank, white sheets. There were no transfers, no shell companies, no forensic map. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her mother hadn't been documenting Robert's crimes. She had been losing her mind. The ledger was a symptom of the dementia the family had kept hidden, a desperate attempt by a dying woman to find patterns where there were none. The evidence Sarah had risked her life for, the proof she thought would save her, was nothing more than the scribblings of a broken mind. She looked at her hands, the skin ruined, the nerves screaming, all for a book of blank paper. She looked out the window again. The officers were stepping out of their cars. Robert was on the porch, pointing toward the shed, his face a mask of feigned concern. She realized then the depth of the trap. Robert knew the ledger was empty. He had known all along. He had let her find it, let her fight for it, just to ensure she was caught red-handed with stolen property that proved nothing. She wasn't a whistleblower. She was a thief who had burned herself for a delusion. She had no money, no heirloom, no legal claim, and now no evidence. She was a fugitive on her own land, and the only thing she had left was a book of empty pages. The door of the shed creaked open. Officer James Wilson stepped inside, his hand on his holster. He looked at the fire, the charred book, and Sarah's ruined hands. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire city. 1, 2, 3. He whispered under his breath, counting the steps as he approached her. "Miss Miller, you need to come with me." Sarah didn't fight as they led her to the patrol car. The handcuffs bit into her burned wrists, a new kind of pain that she welcomed because it felt real. She sat in the back of the cruiser, the plastic seat cold against her back. Through the window, she saw Robert and Jennifer on the porch. They were holding crystal flutes, the amber liquid inside catching the light of the police sirens. Robert said something to the commanding officer, gesturing toward his head with a sympathetic tilt, mentally unstable, grief-stricken. The lies were so thick they were almost visible, a fog surrounding the house. Click. Sarah's thumb found the counter in her pocket. It was the only thing they hadn't taken. Then, a black town car pulled up to the gate. A man stepped out, Richard Brooks. He was sweating despite the cold, his hands fumbling with a tattered accordion folder. He walked toward Robert, and in his hand, he held a small, velvet box. The sapphire. Sarah leaned forward, her face pressed against the glass of the patrol car. She watched as Brooks opened the box to show Robert. The blue light of the police cruiser hit the stone, and for a second, it didn't look like glass or jewelry. It looked like a star. Sarah's eyes narrowed. She didn't look at the beauty of the stone. She looked at the setting. She looked at the way the light refracted through the facets. A specific, 58-facet, brilliant cut that had been a signature of the 1920s. Wait. She remembered a file from her mother's archives. The real archives. The ones she digitized years ago. A report from the International Art Loss Register. "Officer?" Sarah said, her voice sharp and clear. "Observation. That man at the gate is Richard Brooks. Fact. He is in possession of a stolen artifact." Officer Wilson looked back at her, his expression skeptical. "Miss, your father says you're not well. Serial number 8842-B. Sarah shouted, the numbers erupting from her memory like a lifeline. "It's a cornflower sapphire stolen from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in 1974. My mother didn't buy it. Robert didn't inherit it. Richard Brooks's father was the one who found it." Wilson paused. He looked at the man at the gate, then back at Sarah. The mention of a specific museum serial number wasn't the talk of a grief-stricken woman. It was the talk of a professional. "Check the database," Sarah pleaded. "If that stone is the 8842-B, it doesn't belong to the Millers. It belongs to the state. And if Robert is using it to pay a debt, he's laundering stolen property." Wilson hesitated, then reached for his radio. The next hour was a blur of shouting and flashing lights. The predatory lender wasn't so predatory when faced with a federal theft warrant. The police seized the ring, and Robert's face transformed from a mask of victory to a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Without the ring to settle the debt, his firm would collapse by morning. Jennifer tried to slip away toward the garage, but another officer blocked her path. Sarah watched as the stepmother dropped her peppermint socialite act, her eyes turning cold and tactical as she realized the game was up. Sarah sat in the back of the car as the sun began to rise over the Greenwich estate. The house looked different in the dawn light. Not like a fortress, but like a hollow shell. She was eventually released. The charges were dropped in exchange for her testimony against Brooks and the forensic details of the ring's provenance. She didn't get the sapphire back. It was returned to the museum, where it belonged. Months later, Sarah stood in a small cemetery in Boston. The air was crisp, smelling of salt and old stone. Her hands were scarred, the skin tight and pale, but they didn't shake. She looked down at her mother's headstone. She didn't have the ring. She didn't have the gallery. The Miller name was a punchline in the financial news, a story of greed and stolen jewels. But as she stood there, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver digital counter. She looked at the number on the screen. 0. She set the counter on the base of the headstone and walked away. She didn't need to count the lies anymore. She had finally found the one truth that mattered. She was no longer a piece on Robert's board. She was the one who had walked away from the game. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the sea, and for the first time in years, Sarah Miller breathed in the air and didn't taste the smoke.